Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description. It'll take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We are in person, and you can also find us online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue on in our study of the book of Acts, we're in session 10 today, which is titled Calling. And we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 16. So again, this is session 10, titled Calling, looking at Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 16. As we dive into our study this morning, I want to read for you kind of the introductory paragraph and what would be our personal study guide. And it says this, it says, many people think of God's calling only in terms of vocational Christian ministry. A successful businessman who has led a sinful lifestyle repented and gave his life to Christ. Thinking God was calling him into ministry, he resigned from his job and went to seminary. Later, the individual realized that God's call isn't always vocational ministry. God was calling him to be a witness in the business world, and God calls and uses people in all kinds of ways. And this leads the book to ask this initial question, which is this: how does a person's vocation connect to his or her calling or purpose in life? And so I want you to take a couple of minutes, and I want you to think about that. I want you to think about how God might use your vocation, your job, or whatever it is that you do with your day. How might God use that to do ministry, or as the greater calling on your life to share people and that greater purpose in life? Take a couple minutes, talk about that, maybe talk about as how that might work in different areas of life, but also specifically to you. How might God use your current vocation, your current job, whether that's student, teacher, businessman, whatever it might be, to accomplish it, to do ministry, and to kind of fulfill God's call in your life? Take a couple minutes. We're going to have you pause the video. If you're watching this by yourself, get a pen and paper, write some things down. If you're watching this with other people, have a conversation, and then whenever you're done, either writing or talking, just hit play again, and then we'll keep going on our study. So again, how does a person's vocation connect to his or her calling or ministries or purpose in life? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. Well, as our story that started our time together indicated, I've known many people who have used their vocation, used your ministry as a way to fulfill their ministry. I've known people who have worked in the medical field, and not only do they use that as an opportunity to pray with people, to be at the hospital, to do visitation, but also to encourage people and help point people to Christ when they're in moments of crisis. I've known teachers who have loved their kids well, and then when opportunities came, was able to do ministry, or even as kids came into a more general context or even into the church, they became that familiar face that they knew and was able to kind of show them that other side of things and show them kind of how their relationship with the Lord affected just their grace and their hospitality and their love in the classroom. I've seen people do that in retail. I've seen people do that in the food service. I have seen people do that as retired persons and how they use their free time after retirement in order to be a witness for Christ. I've seen it every way imaginable. And the reality is God has called all of us to fulfill the Great Commission. And part of the way that we fulfill that Great Commission is by being a witness at our workplace. The book has this to say. It says Saul's conversion, which is going to be the focus of our session, it ought to draw our attention to how Jesus changed Saul's life and pray about how he might be changing our lives and calling us into a greater purpose. So, as we get into our text today, we're going to see a shift from last week. If you remember last week, we were talking about Philip and we were talking about, the things that had gone on with him. But this week we're shifting back to this guy named Saul, who we're going to eventually know as Paul, as the Apostle Paul. But if we remember from what we knew about Saul from a couple sessions ago, back when in chapter 8 and the things that had gone on, he was not a good dude. He disliked the church. He had been in full approval of what happened to Stephen, even kind of like overseeing it and being the one who kind of made sure it happened. And that led to this full persecution of the early church and a scattering that goes with that. And so Paul was known for and had really been identified as this devout opponent to Jesus because he believed that he was serving God and serving the Jewish faith in that way. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into Acts chapter 9, and we're going to start off in verse 3. But go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 on your own. We're going to start off in verse 3 and read verses 3 and 4. And as we do that, I want you to identify what Saul is doing and where he's going. So picking up in Acts chapter 9, starting in verse 3, let's look at this. It says this. As he, which is Paul, traveled, he was nearing Damascus. A light from heaven suddenly flashed around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" So what we have happening here of kind of what's going on is Saul is making his way up to Damascus. And he has, if we look at the first two verses, what you'll see is he's done that because he has been given permission from the high priest to go to Damascus and to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem. Now, I want you to understand something about Damascus. Damascus is a city that would be considered kind of in the northernmost part of what would have been old Israel. So if we go all the way back to the unified kingdom, Damascus was that earliest thing. When we see the divided kingdom, Damascus kind of in a lot of ways kind of became this kind of symbolic of the capital of the northern kingdom. Damascus really represents like the farthest most point of what would have been kind of old Israel, or kind of the place that you would expect to find Jews and Jewish people still living. In fact, Damascus, and the book says that the Damascus was known for having 2 synagogues there, which kind of pointed out not only was it a large city, but also that it had a large enough Jewish population that it required 2 separate synagogues, 2 separate meeting places for Jews to gather to hear from the scriptures and to celebrate their faith. And so he says, hey, I want to go to the northernmost city. I want to go, up to this northernmost kind of place in our sphere of influence, and I want to go after Christians. And so there's an acknowledgement here that the Christian faith has spread, that Saul has a problem with this. And so he's going out as far as really he can from Jerusalem northward in order to address it and in order to persecute and create problems. The book says this to say, it says Damascus was so far to the north that it isn't even on a map of things that might be found in the book, and that it was evidence of Saul's commitment to destroy the church. He was willing to go as far as he could. He was willing to go quite literally off the map in what we might see in order to make sure that this Christian movement was being eradicated. And yet we see how God intervenes in our passage today, quite literally, shining a light at him, dropping him to his feet, dropping him to the ground, from his feet, and saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" The book points this out. It says that Jesus took Saul's persecution personally. That it wasn't that Saul was attacking his church. It wasn't that Saul was attacking innocent people. It was Saul was attacking Jesus personally. This leads the book to ask this question: how does God confront people today about their rejection of him? And in what ways have you observed God's intervention with someone who opposes Christ? Take a couple minutes, think about that, respond to that either in writing or in discussion, and then we'll keep going in our study. I'll tell you what, and I try to be careful about this because we have heard on multiple occasions people who may come from a different faith background, Christians from a different kind of theological background, make some pretty wild claims about things that God has done in judgment of other people. And I think we want to be careful about that. But I'll tell you that on kind of a smaller scale, that there have been times where I've known people that have really rejected Christ and rejected what he would have for them, and kind of really experienced them, or really what witnessed as they experienced some significant hardship, experienced loss, and really gone through some trying times. And my heart has really broken for them. And sometimes that's brought them back into a more meaningful relationship with Christ. I think, unfortunately, a lot more often, it just hardened their heart more, and they really suffered and they really struggled because of it. And it was really heartbreaking. But we do see that on occasion when people are opposed to Christ, they are angry towards Christ and all that. They tend to, battle a lot of demons, and whether it's depression and anxiety, whether it's alcoholism, or just this overwhelming sense of lostness and meaningless in the world. It's often when we see people that really reject Christ and really want nothing to do with it, with a relationship with Him, that, man, that's a hard way to go. And it's not that Christians have an easy life and non-Christians have a hard life, but it's just that when both have struggles or when both have trials, the one who has placed their hope and trust in Jesus Christ, often they can navigate those things. They overcome. They see the positive. And a lot of times when they don't have that relationship with Christ, that it's negative, that there's no hope, there's a lot of hopelessness, and just really it's a sorrowful thing to kind of witness, and it's hard to be around them because they don't see any good in any of the struggles that life throws at all of us. Let's keep going in our study, though. Let's look at what kind of happens beyond this. So we have Saul. He's on his way to Damascus. He's going there to persecute Christians. He is struck by this bright light. It brings him down to the ground, and he hears through kind of this light, and he hears a voice that says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Let's see how Saul responds to this. We're going to look at verses 5 through 9, and I want you to kind of think about, what would your state of mind be? What would you be thinking in the midst of this entire event? So picking up in verse 5, we see this. "Who are you, Lord?" Saul said. "I am Jesus, the one that you are persecuting. But get up and go into the city, and you will find what to do, and you will be told what you must do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the sound but seeing no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they took him by the hand, and they led him into Damascus. He was unable to see for 3 days, and he did not eat or drink. So let's think about this for a second. What was his state of mind? So right off the bat, you have this man who hates Christianity, hates the movement, may have even been present and aware of Jesus' crucifixion. He was certainly aware of the resurrection claims. He's persecuted the church. He's now gone on this trip with the intent to go and arrest men and women and bring them into judgment. Could have very well already assisted in the persecution and even the execution of other Christians. And then he comes face to face with this bright light and this voice. And even in the midst of it, acknowledging, "Who are you, Lord? Who are you, Master? Who are you, spiritual being that is confronting me right now?" Only to hear it say, "I am Jesus." And I can only imagine that there is a sense of absolute fear and terror upon hearing that voice, and not only saying, "I am Jesus, the one that you are persecuting." And so when you think about state of mind, there is probably a moment of absolute terror where he is acknowledging that whatever being is speaking to him is certainly supernatural, and he's assuming, probably by the light and all that's happening, that it is from God. And then to hear that this encounter that he believes to be a divine encounter is a divine encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And so I can only imagine the fear and terror in the midst of all this, but then to be told, "Get up," not "don't be afraid." Notice this is one of those few times that someone has an encounter with God that he's not told to "don't be afraid." He says, "Get up and go back into town, and I'm going to tell you what you're going to do." And then the light disappears. The people that are with him has witnessed it as well. They've seen the light. They've heard the noise, but they don't know what's happened. But then as he gets up, he's blind and he can't see, and he has to be led by hand into the city of Damascus. I hope, and I have no idea of this, I hope that He was close to Damascus when this all happened, so it wasn't a long trip, because I cannot imagine walking a significant distance into a city that maybe I'm unfamiliar with, blind and newly blind, so you don't know any tricks, you don't have any help, and to be quite literally led by hand through all of that. The feeling of dependence and helplessness was probably astounding. We have this man who was a leader, who was an influencer, who had power, who was doing something for the religious leaders and for the Jewish faith, suddenly has an encounter with Jesus, discovers that the one he is opposing is indeed divine, and now finds himself in a place of absolute dependence and helplessness. The change is so strong. The book says this. It says, while Luke only mentions Jesus' voice, Paul also says that he had seen a vision of Jesus. We see this in 1 Corinthians 9:1 as well as 15:8. Paul quite literally has seen and had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Jesus exerted his authority over Paul's life, and Paul and Saul ultimately responds to Jesus' authority by calling him Lord and recognizing this, including, I would say, the act of fasting after that he was preparing himself for whatever God was doing. The book says this. It says, God immediately commanded Saul to obey, and Saul had no choice since he was absolutely helpless and blind. God had humbled Saul so that he could use Saul for his purposes. This leads the book to ask this question, which: how might encountering Jesus blind a person and open his or her? How might encountering Jesus blind a person and open his or her eyes at the same time? That's a fun question. How might having an encounter with Jesus both blind them but also open their eyes at the same time? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. I always look at this passage, and when I think about what happened to Saul, is Saul suddenly is God. There's almost an object lesson here where up to this point, Saul thought that he was right. He thought that he was the one seeing this most clearly, that Christianity was a threat, that these people were a threat, that maybe other people like the gentleman in Acts Acts chapter 5 that said we just need to leave these people alone. Who is that? Gamaliel. That he would disagree with Lamon. He's like, I'm the only one seeing clearly. I'm the only one that understands what an awful threat this group is, and that we need to deal with them, and we need to stop them, and we need to annihilate this movement before it becomes a problem. I feel like as Saul makes his way up to Damascus, he probably had in his head that he was the only one who really understood, that really saw clearly what a huge threat this was. And the reality is he was thoroughly blind to the truth that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And so what happens here is Jesus strikes him blind to show him, this is how blind you really were. You were blind to the truth. You thought you could see, but in reality you were blind. And so now I'm going to make you blind so that you will finally see. And so I think an encounter with Jesus is that way. It's one of the things that happens with an encounter of Jesus is that we begin to see how blind we really were. When the Holy Spirit convicts us, when we have this encounter with Christ, however that might be, through reading our word, through the church gathered, through a special event, whatever it is, that we begin to see how blind we really are, and we are offered the opportunity to finally see the truth and to see clearly. I think that's true. I think sometimes when you have people that reject that and refuse to believe, I believe that spiritual blindness compounds itself. And while I think that God can do a mighty work in anybody's life, I think it is through an encounter with Jesus that we're actually able to see our need for salvation, and we are called to respond to that in saving faith. And so, such a great thing. And I think it's such a kind of an object lesson is presented there, that this man who thought he saw clearly was struck blind so that he might truly see and understand the truth that Jesus is alive and that he is the Christ. Let's look at how this story ends. We're going to look at verses 10 through 13. As we do this, I want you to notice the details about Ananias and also with that kind of what job he is given and what the future is going to be. So let's read verses 10 through 16 together now. It says this: Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. Here I am, Lord, he replied. Get up and go to the street called Straight. The Lord said to him, to the house of Judas, and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, since he is praying there. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias coming in and placing his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. Lord, Ananias answered, I have heard from many people about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and that he has authority here from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go, for this man is my chosen instrument to take my name to Gentiles, kings, and Israelites. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. So, as we look at this passage, we're introduced to Ananias. The book says this about Ananias, that he was basically an unknown believer, but God had a big job for him to accomplish. You kind of love this, and there's really a formula here that the Lord speaks to Ananias. Ananias is praying, and the Lord speaks to him, and he says, Here I am, Lord. But if you go into the Old Testament, every time that God really kind of begins this prophetic work or speaks to someone, you kind of see that same interaction that he says their name and they respond with, Here I am, and that's kind of that openness, that readiness to receive whatever God is telling him. And so he does. He says, You're going to go, and he gives him a street, he gives him a person, he gives him the name, all of those things. He says, I want you to go to this person. He's expecting you. And when you get there, you're going to lay your hands on him so that he might have his sight restored. Now, Ananias knew who Saul was. He knew the history. He knew what he had been doing in Jerusalem. He had the news of Saul had preceded him, so much so that they knew that Saul had come to Damascus to arrest people, to cause problems, to hurt the church. And so he says, Lord, this is what I've heard about this guy. And it's not that he doesn't think God knows it, but he's just trying to gain understanding. He's not telling him no. He's not rejecting it. He's not questioning God. He's just saying, God, this is who this man is. And then I love what the book says. It says, God knew that Ananias was faithful and obedient, and that was important for this task. For his part, Ananias knew that Saul had come to cause trouble for the Christians, so he had reason to be concerned. And that leads the book to ask a question, which is this: what fears sometimes make us hesitate to be obedient to God's direction? Take a couple minutes and discuss that. And I think he's not saying no, obviously, but he's saying, hey, God, this is who this man is. This man's wanting to do harm to the church. And so there's a hesitation there. What are some hesitations that we have today? What are some reasons that we might hesitate today to follow God's direction? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll start wrapping up our study. All right, so what are the hesitations that we might have today? And really, when I think about this, there's always the reality of a cost. And I think that's hard. And I don't know if that's a uniquely American thing or if it's a Christchurch thing in general. But I think a lot of us have a really hard time when it comes to Christianity about being obedient when it comes at a cost, when it's going to cost us financial gain, when it's going to cost us friendship, when it's going to cost us influence, when it's going to make people think a certain way about us, when it might cost us a relationship. I've worked with youth and young adults for a long time, and I've known lots of young people who have been following the Lord, have been trusting in the Lord, but then they meet someone that they really care about, usually someone of the opposite sex, wanting to have a potential spouse or partner, and that person doesn't walk with the Lord, and then suddenly their faith becomes less and less and less important. And when you challenge them, you say, hey, this person doesn't know Christ, this person's not walking with Jesus, this person is encouraging you to not walk with Jesus. Like, how are you going to make your faith a point of conversation? How are you going to bring your faith into this relationship? And they're not willing to do it because they're afraid that if they really kind of show them, hey, my faith is a big deal and I want to walk with Jesus and I want to be in a relationship where we both walk with Christ, they're afraid that it's going to cost them the relationship. And this can be true even of sometimes family members. When God's done a work in someone's life and they've got a family member that doesn't know Christ, but they're close with that family member, maybe it's a relative, maybe it's a grandparent or a child or a grandchild or a cousin or who knows, aunt, uncle, who knows. And they hesitate to kind of share their faith and to tell people about Jesus because they're afraid it's going to cause friction at Thanksgiving or in a relationship or in a friendship or whoever it might be. And it's just always that idea of being willing to accept the cost. Jesus himself challenged his disciples to say, count the cost. He says, if you were going to build a tower, the first thing you would do is make sure that you have the money and the materials to do it. Otherwise, you're going to only half build the tower and people are going to make fun of you. If a king is going out to war and he realizes that the opposing person is more powerful than them, they're going to assess, is there any way we can win this? And the answer is no. Then they're going to go out and they're going to make terms for peace because they're going to do that. Otherwise, they're going to go out and they're going to be they're going to be utterly destroyed. And I think that's true in our faith too, is a lot of times we don't necessarily count the cost of what it means to follow Jesus. And so when it comes to a point where being a follower of Jesus is going to cost us something, we tend to hesitate and we struggle to do those things that may cost us something. And that's true of all of us, and that's true of me too. And it's hard, but it's something that I think leads us to hesitation. The book says this. It says that God knew everything about Saul. So nothing that Ananias said to him was new. But all along with that, he had a plan for Saul's life, and that was enough to convince Ananias to follow through with God's instruction. As a result, Saul would make a huge difference. Not only would there be a difference in Saul's life, but that the world would be changed through the ministry of Saul. It's important to note in our passage that with that came the suffering and the trials and the challenges that God promised Saul would experience. So to close out our time today, I want to ask you one more question, and it's a great personal question. It's, how do you know that the Lord is calling you? And what confirmation did you find from Scripture and from your Christian friends about your calling? And I want to really maybe kind of take even one step back and just say, how is God calling you into ministry? How is God calling you to go and to serve and to fulfill the Great Commission and to be a part of the church? How is God calling you to ministry? And then with that, how did you know? What confirmations were out there? Take some time and really talk about that, because maybe you haven't really shared that. You have not really told people how you think God's calling you to serve and to further the kingdom. This is a great opportunity to really think about that, pray about that, and ask the questions. How is God calling me? How do I know God's calling me to do that? And what evidence do I have that? What has convinced me that may be where God's calling you to serve in the church? And so with that in mind, answer those questions. We would encourage you to close your time in prayer, especially praying for what God may be calling you to do. And if you haven't done anything yet, what first steps might you need to be taking, or what doors need to be open for you to fulfill that ministry? Close that time with prayer and then join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. We meet at 11 o'clock. Join us in person, but you can also find us online through Facebook Live. Thank you for joining us for this study this morning. God bless.